Her name tag said Sarah Cross, Run, and nobody at Coastal Memorial had bothered to learn much more about her than that. For 3 years, she had worked the night shift in the emergency department, moving between curtained bays with a quiet efficiency that other nurses envied but never questioned. She was good at her job. Everyone agreed on that. But good was a word people used when they had decided not to look closer. On the night everything changed, the rain was hammering the ambulance bay doors hard enough to rattle the glass, and Sarah was charting vitals for a man with a broken wrist when the doors burst open. 2 paramedics wheeled in a gurney at a dead run, and behind them came a phalanx of security personnel in dark suits, moving with the tight, coordinated urgency of men who were used to protecting someone important. Dr. Marcus Halloway, the attending on duty, stepped into the hallway with his arms crossed, already annoyed by the disruption to his orderly department. "What do we have?" he said. Not really a question, more a demand for someone to justify the chaos. Gunshot wound, right upper quadrant, blood pressure crashing. 1 paramedic barked. Patient is a retired Navy Rear Admiral. Secret Service is insisting on a full security sweep before anyone touches him. Halloway's eyebrows rose at the word Admiral, and Sarah watched the shift happen in his face, the sudden calculation of importance, the recalibration of urgency. "Get him into trauma too," Halloway said. "I want imaging, I want type and cross, I want this handled fast and clean." The gurney rolled past Sarah as she stood near the supply cart, restocking gauze with the same unhurried hands she used every night. She didn't look up. She had learned, over 3 years, that looking up invited questions she couldn't answer. But then, the man on the gurney groaned, a low guttural sound of pain breaking through sedation, and one of the younger nurses beside him began to panic. "His pressure's dropping again. I can't get a line in. He's thrashing." Sarah's hands stopped moving on the gauze. She didn't decide to speak. It happened before thought could catch up to instinct. "Hey," she said, low and even, stepping toward the gurney without hurry. "You're safe. You're at the hospital. I need you to breathe with me, slow, in through your nose." It was nothing dramatic, just a voice, calm as still water, cutting through the noise of the trauma bay. But the Admiral's eyes snapped open. His hand shot out and grabbed the gurney rail so hard his knuckles went white, and he said one word that stopped every person in that hallway cold. "Stop." Halloway turned. "Irritated, sir. We need to keep moving. You're losing blood." I said stop the gurney. The Admiral's voice, weak from blood loss, still carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded warships. That voice. I know that voice. He turned his head, searching the hallway with eyes glassy from pain and shock, until they landed on Sarah standing by the supply cart with a roll of gauze still in her hand. "Doc," he whispered. "Doc Kingsley." The hallway went silent, except for the beeping of a monitor and the distant hum of the rain outside. Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her, felt 6 years of careful erasure crack down the middle, like ice under too much weight. Nobody had called her that name in a very long time. "Sir, I think you're confused," Halloway said, stepping between them with the reflexive protectiveness of a man defending his patient from an unstable stranger. "This is a nurse. Her name is Sarah Cross. I don't care what her badge says." The Admiral's grip on the rail tightened. "I was on the US Camden 6 years ago when we took 2 Exocet hits off the Strait of Hormuz. Fire in the aft compartment, 41 wounded, and I was one of them, gutted open on a mess table because the sick bay had already burned. His breath hitched, but he kept talking, kept forcing the words out like a man determined to finish before his body gave out. There was a surgeon who worked on me for 6 hours straight while the ship was still burning. Combat medic training gone, half her equipment melted, doing an emergency thoracotomy with a folding knife and a headlamp. She talked to me the whole time, told me to breathe, told me I wasn't going to die on her table. He looked at Sarah, and his eyes were wet, and his voice cracked when he said the next part. I never forgot that voice. I've heard it in my nightmares for 6 years, and I am telling you, that is Commander Sarah Kingsley, United States Navy, Trauma Surgery, Fleet Surgical Team 3. Holloway looked at Sarah like he was seeing her for the first time, and in a way, he was. That's absurd, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. She's a floor nurse. She's been here 3 years. I would know if she was a surgeon. Sarah set down the gauze. Her hands were steady, but something in her chest had come loose, some carefully bolted door swinging open on rusted hinges. His pressure is what? She asked, and her voice had changed, flattened into something clinical and sharp. 82/40 and dropping, the young nurse said, startled by the shift in her. Get me the ultrasound. Now, Holloway stiffened. Excuse me? I am the attending physician on this case, and you will not be giving orders, Dr. Holloway. Your patient has a gunshot wound to the right upper quadrant, distended abdomen, and dropping pressure despite fluids. That is not just bleeding. That is likely a hepatic injury, with possible cardiac involvement from a fragment track. And if you image him lying flat, you will lose him before radiology finishes their first pass. The words came out of her in a rhythm that had been beaten into her over a decade of combat medicine, precise and unwavering. And for one long second Holloway simply stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman who restocked gauze carts with the voice now cutting through his hospital like a blade. She's right, the Admiral rasped. Listen to her. For God's sake, listen to her. Holloway's jaw worked. Pride and fear waged a short, silent war behind his eyes. Then the monitor screamed a warning, the Admiral's oxygen saturation collapsing, and pride lost. Do it, Holloway said. Whoever you are, do it. Sarah moved. She grabbed the portable ultrasound from the young nurse's hands and pressed the probe against the Admiral's abdomen with a speed and confidence that made the entire trauma team freeze in place. Free fluid, right upper quadrant, and look at this. She turned the screen toward Holloway. Pericardial effusion. The bullet fragmented. One piece nicked the liver, another's tracked up toward the heart. He's tamponading. Holloway's face went pale. That's not possible from that entry wound. It is if the round hit a rib first and fragmented on impact. I've seen it a dozen times. Eared shrapnel does the same thing, changes trajectory when it clips bone. Sarah's hands were already moving, snapping on gloves, reaching for a scalpel tray with the muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions. He needs a pericardial window right now or his heart stops in the next 90 seconds. We don't have a cardiothoracic surgeon on call until there isn't time for on call. I'm doing it. Holloway grabbed her arm. You are a nurse. I don't care what some delirious patient thinks he remembers. I am not letting an unlicensed staff member perform an emergency thoracotomy in my emergency room. Sarah turned to him, and for the first time in 3 years, she let her guard drop entirely. My name is Commander Sarah Kingsley. I served 11 years as a trauma surgeon with the United States Navy. I performed 43 emergency thoracotomies in combat conditions with mortality outcomes better than most Level 1 trauma centers in this country. This man will die in the next minute if you do not get out of my way. The room had gone utterly silent except for the dying rhythm of the monitor. Holloway looked at her for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 2 seconds, and something in his face broke open, some old certainty giving way to the plain evidence in front of him. "Do it," he said. "Someone get her a gown. Move." What happened next would be talked about in that hospital for years. Sarah's hands did not shake. She made the incision along the 5th intercostal space with a single fluid motion, no hesitation, no wasted movement, narrating each step in short, clipped sentences that were somehow both instruction and prayer. Rib spreader. I need better exposure. There, pericardium is tense. That confirms tamponade. I'm opening it now. Blood and fluid released in a rush, and the Admiral's blood pressure, which had been crashing towards 0, began to climb on the monitor almost immediately. "Pressure's coming up," someone called out, disbelief thick in their voice. "Find the bleeder," Sarah said, half to herself, her fingers working inside the chest cavity with a precision that looked less like surgery and more like some kind of terrible, beautiful dance. There, small laceration on the right ventricle, superficial. I can repair this without bypass. She sutured with tiny, exact movements, her voice never rising, never wavering, narrating for the benefit of the stunned residents crowding the doorway. This is why you don't wait for imaging in a penetrating chest trauma with hemodynamic instability. In the field, you don't have 40 minutes for a CT scan. You have your hands and your judgment. Half the men I lost overseas, I lost because someone waited too long trying to be certain, instead of acting on probability. The suture held. The bleeding slowed to a trickle, then stopped. "Pressure is 110/70, the anesthesiologist said, and there was something like awe in his voice. Sats back up to 96. Sarah closed the pericardial window, checked the liver laceration, packed it, and stepped back from the table, her gloves soaked red to the wrist, her breathing finally, only now, coming a little unsteady. "He's stable," she said. "Get him to the OR for definitive repair, but he's stable." Nobody moved for a moment. Then the room exploded into motion, nurses grabbing the gurney, calling for the operating suite, and Holloway stood there with his mouth slightly open, staring at the woman he had dismissed as a nurse an hour earlier. "How?" he said finally. "How does a floor nurse know how to do that?" Sarah stripped off her gloves, and her hands, finally, began to tremble. "Because I wasn't always a floor nurse," she said quietly. "Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, because stories like this one deserve to travel." The Admiral was moved to the operating room within minutes, and the surgical team took over the definitive repair, while Sarah stood outside the doors, her scrubs soaked through, her hands still shaking with an adrenaline she hadn't felt in 6 years. Holloway found her an hour later in the staff lounge, sitting alone with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just sat down across from her, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its earlier arrogance. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I have been running this emergency department for 14 years, and I have never seen anything like what you did in that trauma bay." You didn't know, Sarah said. That's not an excuse. I dismissed you because you were a nurse, because you were quiet, because you didn't argue with me the way the residents do. I decided who you were before I ever asked. Sarah finally looked up at him. Most people do. Tell me what happened, Holloway said. Not the medicine, the rest of it. Why does a Navy commander with your skill set end up mopping floors in my emergency room, metaphorically speaking? Sarah was quiet for a long time, turning the coffee cup slowly between her hands. The Camden wasn't just an accident, she finally said. Everyone believes it was an Exocet strike. Bad luck, wrong place at the wrong time. That's the official story. It's not true. Holloway leaned forward. 6 months before we got hit, I found discrepancies in the medical requisitions for my unit. Supplies meant for wounded sailors were being diverted, sold through a contractor with ties to a defense procurement officer named Vance Ridgway. I reported it. Through the proper channels, exactly the way I was trained to. And 2 weeks later, we were sent into a patrol route that naval intelligence had already flagged as compromised. We were sitting ducks. 41 wounded, 6 dead, and when the investigation happened afterward, all the evidence I'd gathered about the requisition fraud disappeared. Ridgway made sure the official narrative was equipment failure and bad intelligence. Nothing about corruption. Nothing about me. They buried it, Holloway said slowly. They buried it, and they buried me with it. I was quietly discharged under a medical pretext. My clearance was revoked, and I was told, very politely, by a man in a very expensive suit, that my career in military medicine was over, and that continuing to talk about the requisition fraud would not be good for my health or my family's. So you disappeared. I changed my name legally back to my mother's maiden name, I let my medical license lapse under my old name, and I got recertified quietly as an ARN because it required less paperwork and less scrutiny than reactivating a surgical license. I have spent 6 years trying to become invisible. Holloway sat back, absorbing this. And the Admiral tonight, he knew you from the Camden. He was one of the wounded. I didn't know his name was attached to Ridgway's investigation until years later. Admiral Holt commanded the flotilla. He was the one who ordered the inquiry that got shut down. I always assumed he was part of the cover-up. But he recognized you. He fought to get you into that trauma bay, which means either he wasn't part of it, Sarah said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it, or he spent 6 years trying to find out what really happened, the same as me. Before Holloway could respond, a nurse burst into the lounge, breathless. Dr. Holloway, there are men here asking for Sarah Cross. They say they're with a federal agency. They want to know why a civilian nurse performed unlicensed cardiac surgery on a retired flag officer. Sarah's blood went cold. What do they look like? She asked, already standing. Dark suits. One of them showed a badge that said Naval Criminal Investigative Service, but Dr. Holloway, something about it didn't look right to me. Sarah's mind raced back 6 years, to a man in an expensive suit telling her that continuing to talk would not be good for her health, and she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that Ridgway had found her. "Where are they now?" she asked. "In the hallway outside recovery, waiting for the Admiral to come out of surgery." Sarah moved before she had fully decided to, striding down the hallway with Holloway close behind her, and she found 2 men in dark suits standing exactly where the nurse said they would be, flanked by the same Secret Service detail that had escorted the Admiral in. The taller of the two men turned as she approached, and Sarah recognized him immediately. Though 6 years had put grey in his hair and lines around his eyes. "Vance Ridgway." "Commander Kingsley," he said, and his smile was thin and cold. "I had heard rumors you'd resurfaced. I didn't believe them until tonight." "You're not in Sis," Sarah said quietly. "I'm whatever the situation requires me to be." Ridgway glanced at the Secret Service agents flanking him, and something passed between them that made Sarah's skin crawl. "The Admiral is a very sick man. It would be a shame if complications arose during his recovery. Is that a threat?" "It's a professional courtesy. You disappeared once. You were smart to do it. I would encourage you to consider disappearing again, tonight, before this becomes complicated for everyone involved." Sarah felt Holloway stiffen beside her, felt the weight of the moment pressing down, and she understood with sudden clarity that she had a choice to make. She could vanish into the night the way she had 6 years ago, protect herself, let the Admiral's recovery play out however it would, and go back to being invisible. Or she could stand her ground for the first time in 6 years. What would you have done in her position? Share your thoughts in the comments. "The Admiral is going to wake up," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "And when he does, he is going to remember exactly who saved his life tonight, and he is going to want to know why. I'm not disappearing, Ridgway, not this time." Ridgway's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went hard and calculating. "You're making a mistake. The mistake was 6 years ago, when you buried an investigation that got 6 sailors killed to protect a supply contract. I have documentation. I kept copies before I was discharged. Copies you never found because I hid them somewhere your people never thought to look. This was technically a bluff. She had memories, not documents. But she watched Ridgway's composure flicker, just slightly, and she knew she had struck a nerve. "That's an interesting claim," he said carefully. "It's an interesting claim that becomes very easy to verify the moment I hand it to a journalist, or to the Senate Armed Services Committee, or to Admiral Holt himself, who I suspect would be extremely interested to learn why his medical records from 6 years ago don't match the official incident report." Ridgway's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, the operating room doors swung open, and a surgical team wheeled the Admiral out on a gurney, sedated but stable, his color returning, his vitals strong on the portable monitor. The lead surgeon, an older man named Dr. Feldman, spotted Sarah and stopped the gurney. "Whoever did the initial repair on this pericardial injury," Feldman said, "saved this man's life. The ventricular laceration was cleanly closed, textbook technique, better than half the cardiothoracic fellows I've trained. I want to know who did that." "I did," Sarah said, not taking her eyes off Ridgway. Feldman looked at her, then at the standoff happening in the hallway, and some instinct for danger, honed by decades of hospital politics, told him to stay quiet and watch. Ridgway looked at the Admiral's stable vitals, looked at the Secret Service detail that had clearly grown less deferential to him in the last several minutes, and made a calculation. "This isn't finished," he said quietly to Sarah, and then he turned and walked away, his associate following, and the hallway seemed to exhale as they disappeared through the exit doors. Sarah stood there, shaking, and Holloway put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Who was that?" he asked. "The man who destroyed my career and got 6 sailors killed," Sarah said. And he just found out I'm not hiding anymore. The Admiral woke up 18 hours later, groggy but coherent, and the first thing he asked for was the woman who had operated on him. Sarah came to his bedside in recovery, still in scrubs, still exhausted, and Admiral Holt looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her in 6 years. Recognition, gratitude, and something like shame. "You saved my life twice," he said, his voice hoarse. "Once on the Camden, once last night. I have spent 6 years trying to find out what happened to you after your discharge, and I never imagined it would end with you saving me again. You knew I'd been discharged. I knew it wasn't right. I fought the board on it, quietly for 2 years, before I was told to stop asking questions if I valued my own pension." He closed his eyes briefly, pain crossing his face that had nothing to do with his surgical wound. "I have spent 6 years living with that shame, Commander. I should have fought harder." "You're fighting now," Sarah said. "I am the ranking flag officer who nearly died last night because of a bullet fired by a man connected to Vance Ridgway's security detail, a man who has been under quiet naval intelligence surveillance for 11 months for suspected arms diversion. This was not a random shooting, Commander. I believe I was targeted because I had reopened the investigation into the Camden 3 weeks ago." Sarah felt the floor tilt again, a second time in as many days. "You reopened it. I found a whistleblower in Ridgway's procurement office, someone willing to testify. I was on my way to meet with Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the real one, when I was shot in a parking garage 2 blocks from this hospital. That's not a coincidence." "No," Holt said grimly. "It is not, and I would like your help finishing what you started 6 years ago. Not as a nurse, Commander, as the surgeon and officer you actually are." The next several days moved fast. Naval Intelligence, contacted directly by Admiral Holt from his hospital bed, confirmed within 48 hours that Ridgway had been under investigation for exactly the fraud Sarah had reported 6 years earlier, and that new evidence, corroborated by the whistleblower's testimony and by Sarah's own recovered records, which she had, in fact, kept hidden in a safety deposit box under her mother's maiden name, was enough to secure an arrest warrant. Ridgway was taken into custody 11 days after the shooting, in a quiet, unglamorous arrest outside a Northern Virginia office building, and the story that unfolded in the following weeks implicated 3 additional officials in the original cover-up. Sarah testified before a closed Senate subcommittee hearing, her naval record fully restored, her name cleared of any wrongdoing, and for the first time in 6 years she said the words "Commander Sarah Kingsley" without flinching. Holloway, for his part, became her fiercest advocate at Coastal Memorial, pushing the hospital board to create something that had never existed there before. A combat trauma integration program designed to bring military-trained trauma surgeons into civilian emergency medicine, bridging the gap between battlefield triage and hospital protocol. He asked Sarah to run it. She sat with the offer for 3 days before she gave her answer, turning it over in her mind the way she once turned over impossible surgical decisions in the dark, sweltering deck of a wounded ship. On the 4th day, she walked into Holloway's office and told him yes. "On one condition," she said. "I want full surgical privileges restored under my real name, and I want the authority to recruit other veterans who've been hiding the way I was. There are more of us out there than you'd think. Skilled people who came home from war and got told there was no place for what they know how to do. Done, Holloway said, without hesitation. 6 months later, the Coastal Memorial Combat Trauma Integration Program had its first graduating class of 5 surgeons, all veterans, all trained by Commander Sarah Kingsley, who now walked the halls of the emergency department not as a quiet nurse restocking gauze, but as the director of a program that was already being studied by hospitals in 4 other states. Admiral Holt visited on the day of the program's official dedication, walking slower than he used to, a cane in one hand, but alive and free, and unburdened for the first time in 6 years by the guilt of a story he had never fully told. He stood at the podium beside her and told the room, full of doctors and nurses and a few reporters who had gotten wind of the extraordinary story behind the program's founding, exactly what had happened on the Camden 6 years earlier. He told them about the fire, about the folding knife, about the headlamp, about a voice that told him he wasn't going to die. I did not recognize her 100 times when I passed her in the years since, he said, because I was looking for a surgeon, and what I found instead was a woman who had been forced to become invisible. It took hearing her voice again, cutting through chaos exactly the way it did 6 years ago, to remind me that the people who save our lives do not always look the way we expect them to. Sarah stood at that podium, looking out over a room full of faces that had once dismissed her or never noticed her at all, and she thought about the version of herself who had spent 3 years restocking gauze and biting her tongue, who had believed that safety meant silence. She thought about the version of herself who had grabbed an ultrasound probe with steady hands, while a room full of doubters held their breath. And she understood, finally, that she did not have to choose between the two. The past she had buried and the present she had built were, in the end, the same woman. She had simply needed someone to hear her voice and stop long enough to recognize it. The dedication ceremony ended, but the story, Sarah knew, was far from finished, because trauma the size of what she carried did not close simply because a program had her name on a plaque outside an office door. In the weeks that followed, the reporters who had caught wind of the story would not let it rest. A national outlet ran a feature titled "The Surgeon Who Disappeared," and within days her inbox filled with messages from strangers, some kind, some cruel, some simply curious about what it felt like to be erased and then remade in the span of a single night. She did not answer most of them, but one message stopped her cold, sent from an address she didn't recognize, 3 lines long, unsigned. "You saved my brother on the Camden. I never got to thank the surgeon who did it, because the Navy told my family the medical team's names were classified. I am glad you are not hiding anymore." Sarah read it 4 times before she set her phone down, and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, she allowed herself to cry, not from grief, but from something closer to relief, the specific relief of a woman who had spent 6 years believing her work in that burning compartment had vanished into the same silence that swallowed everything else. It hadn't vanished. It had simply been waiting for her to be found. Dr. Feldman, the cardiothoracic surgeon who had taken the Admiral into the operating room that first night, became an unlikely mentor in the months that followed, seeking Sarah out during quiet moments on the floor to ask about field techniques he had never had cause to learn, hemostatic packing methods, damage control protocols, the calculus of triage under fire. In 18 years of practice, he told her once, standing over coffee in the surgeon's lounge, "I have never had to decide who gets the only working ventilator. You did that as a matter of routine." It stops being routine, Sarah said. It just becomes something you carry. Feldman nodded slowly, and something passed between them. Not quite friendship yet, but the beginning of the kind of respect that could not be faked or hurried. The program grew faster than the hospital board had anticipated. Within a year, Sarah had recruited 11 more veterans into the Combat Trauma Integration Fellowship, men and women who had spent years working as paramedics, physician assistants, and yes, nurses, hiding advanced surgical training behind civilian job titles, because the credentialing process to reactivate a military medical license was, by design, exhausting, expensive, and slow enough to break most people's resolve. One of them was a former Army trauma surgeon named Dennis Okafor, who had been working as an emergency medical technician in Baltimore for 4 years after his own discharge. Quietly brilliant, quietly furious at a system that had no place for what he knew. I applied to 6 residency programs, he told Sarah during his interview. Every single one wanted me to start from scratch, as though 8 years running a forward surgical team in Kandahar taught me nothing about trauma medicine. It taught you everything that actually matters, Sarah said. The paperwork just hasn't caught up yet. She built the fellowship around that idea that the skills these veterans carried were not deficient versions of civilian training, but a different, harder-won expertise entirely, one that deserved translation rather than dismissal. Dr. Holloway, who had once looked at her like an inconvenience cluttering his emergency department, became the program's most vocal champion within the hospital administration, fighting for funding, fighting for staffing, fighting, on more than one occasion, with insurance auditors who could not understand why a nurse's badge from 3 years earlier now belonged to a surgeon with full privileges. "You could have told me," he said to her one evening, months into their new working relationship, both of them exhausted after a 16-hour shift. "Back at the beginning, you could have told me who you really were. Would you have believed me?" Holloway thought about it, honestly, which Sarah appreciated more than a reflexive yes. "Probably not," he admitted. "I would have thought you were exaggerating, or delusional, or looking for attention. I built my entire career on trusting credentials over instinct, and you didn't have the credentials to show me." "That's the whole problem, isn't it?" Sarah said. "The system is built to trust paper over people. I spent 6 years being paper that didn't exist." "Not anymore," Holloway said. And there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, a long way from the man who had once told her she would not be giving orders in his trauma bay. Admiral Holt's recovery continued steadily, and he made it a point to visit the hospital every few weeks, not as a patient, but as an advocate, using what remained of his considerable influence within the Department of Defense to push for policy changes that would make it easier for military-trained medical personnel to transition into civilian practice without losing years to redundant certification. It was slow work, the kind of institutional change that took hearings and drafts and compromises that satisfied no one completely, but Sarah watched it move forward inch by inch, and she understood that this, too, was a kind of surgery, cutting away the parts of a broken system that had let people like her disappear in the first place. The trial against Vance Ridgway took nearly a year to reach its conclusion. Sarah testified twice more, each time recounting the events on the Camden with a clinical precision that unsettled even the hardened federal prosecutors in the room: the folding knife, the headlamp, the sailors she had lost despite everything she'd tried, and the moment, months later, when a man in an expensive suit told her that continuing to talk would not be good for her health. Ridgway's defense attorneys tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, unstable, embittered. A woman who had spent 6 years constructing a persecution narrative to explain her own professional failures. It did not work. The whistleblower's testimony, corroborated by financial records naval intelligence had spent months assembling, painted a picture too clear and too damning to dismiss. A procurement officer who had systematically diverted medical supplies for profit and then, when confronted with exposure, had arranged for a patrol route compromise that got 6 sailors killed and 41 wounded to bury the evidence along with the bodies. Ridgway was convicted on 11 counts, including conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to manslaughter, and sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Sarah was not in the courtroom. She was in an operating room at Coastal Memorial, elbow deep in a trauma case that could not wait for anyone's personal reckoning, and she learned the news afterward from a text message Admiral Holt sent her, 4 words long. "It is finished. Rest now." She stood in the surgical scrub room reading those words on her phone, still in her bloodied gown, and she felt something in her chest, finally, fully release. A tension she had carried so long, she had stopped recognizing it as tension at all, mistaking it instead for the ordinary weight of being alive. That night, for the first time in 6 years, Sarah Kingsley slept without dreaming of fire. The following spring, the hospital held a second ceremony, smaller than the first, quieter, marking the 1-year anniversary of the Combat Trauma Integration Program and the graduation of its second cohort of veteran surgeons. Sarah stood at the front of the room, no longer surprised by the sound of her own full name, no longer flinching when someone called her commander instead of Nurse Cross, and she watched Dennis Okafor accept his certification with the quiet, disbelieving joy of a man who had spent 4 years being told his expertise belonged nowhere. "This program exists," she told the room, because a hospital finally decided to stop asking what someone's job title said and started asking what they actually knew how to do. That is a small thing to ask of an institution. It should not have taken what it took to get here. She looked out at the audience, at Holloway, sitting in the front row with an expression of unguarded pride, at Admiral Holt leaning on his cane near the back, at Feldman taking notes for what would eventually become a published paper on combat, derived trauma protocols in civilian emergency medicine. And she thought about the woman she had been 3 years earlier, restocking gauze in a supply closet, keeping her head down, believing that safety required silence. That woman had not disappeared. She had simply been waiting, the way a wound waits under a bandage, for the right hands to finally open her back up and let her heal correctly. Sarah Kingsley did not think of herself as fully healed. She understood, with the same clarity she brought to every diagnosis, that some wounds do not close completely, that some losses stay with a person the way shrapnel sometimes stays lodged too close to a vital structure to safely remove. But she had stopped hiding from the wound. She had stopped pretending the scar wasn't there, and in the quiet hours after that second ceremony, standing alone in the hospital corridor, where an admiral's gurney had once rolled past her without a glance, Sarah allowed herself, finally, to simply exist as exactly who she was. Not a ghost, not a cover story, not a name borrowed from her mother to survive, just a surgeon, standing in the hallway of a hospital that had finally learned to see her, waiting for whatever came through those doors next, ready, the way she had always been ready, to save whoever needed saving.